So thank you for watching this video. This is a part of an experiment that we're doing here at Corban of having some interaction with faculty and guests and students. And so hopefully in the future, we're able to get a lot of different people on video and in these discussions. Today, it's a great honor of having our guest, Mark Charles, visiting us. And also part of the team we have here are a couple of our faculty members. And so I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves to us. And then Mark will introduce himself, and then we will start our discussion. So let's start with Jim.
My name is Jim Hills. I'm part of the English department, but I also teach a course called American Thought and Culture, which combines American literature and American history.
And Alan?
My name is Alan Jones. I teach for the School of Ministry, especially in the area of Old Testament, and have an interest in justice and mercy ethic.
Awesome. And so my name is Kersey. I teach theology classes here, and I'm going to be one of the people in these discussions here. And so the person we're really interested in is Mark Charles. So Mark, would you give us a little of your background, where you're from?
Yeah, sure. Let me introduce myself in Navajo first. It's a traditional Navajo greeting. So Yate, Mark Charles Yinashya, Tsin Bake Dinan Nishla, Doto Higlini Bashichin, Tsin Bake Dinan Bashiche, Doto Chitni Bashanella. So in the Navajo culture, we have clans, and we're a matrilineal culture. So your identity comes from your mother's mother. And so my mother's mother is actually American of Dutch heritage. And so when I introduce myself, I say Tsin Bake Dine'e, which literally means the wooden shoe people. And then my father's mother, my second clan, is Toa Higlini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan is also Tsin Bake Dine'e, and my fourth clan is Toda Chitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan, one of the original clans of the Navajo tribe. So thank you for having me. It's my privilege to be here. I'm very excited. Had some great time of conversation with students here at Corban, and have really enjoyed the experience of being here.
Awesome. So just a little bit of your background. So you had mentioned that you were a pastor for a while. Is that correct?
Yes. So I'm not ordained, but I pastored a church within the Christian Reformed denomination. It actually was an emerging church. And so it was called the Christian Indian Center in Denver, Colorado. It was a ministry, it's about 40 years old, of the Christian Reformed Church to the Native community within Denver. And I worked there for 2 years as a bivocational pastor, supporting my family through doing computer consulting and database design, and then pastoring and preaching at the church for about 2 years. While we were there, one of the questions we asked ourselves, the church was asking, was what does it mean to be Navajo and be Christian? And we began dialoguing on what does it mean to contextualize our worship for our indigenous culture. And so it was that conversation that actually led me back to the Navajo reservation, and I moved back there with my family 2 years later so we could fully immerse ourselves within our culture, within our people, and find a better, to really continue to better deal with this question of what does it mean to be Native and be Christian.
So is that a movement that has been active over the last few years?
Yeah. So most Indigenous Christians here and around the world have the experience of what I and others have called being colonized by the gospel. So missionaries came in, but they often came in partnership or in conjunction with the government for the purpose of assimilating natives to European culture or American culture. And so they didn't just come and say, here's this guy Jesus, you should get to know him. They said, here's this guy Jesus, he demands that you worship him in English. Mm-hmm. And you have to get rid of your traditional ways, and you have to bring in an Easter bunny and a Christmas tree into your house and celebrate these holidays instead. And so the church really worked in partnership all throughout the country in assimilating natives to Western European culture. That was done through the churches, that was done through the mission programs, that was done through the boarding schools that were run by both the churches and the government. So most expressions today of established churches on reservations, while the pews are filled with people from the tribes, the culture of the church is very American. And that's the way a lot of the churches do things. So there's been a renaissance in the past several decades of all over the world, native indigenous Christians asking, what does it mean to be in my tribe and be a Christian? And so I was involved through this church. I was involved with a group called the World Christian Gathering on Indigenous Peoples. And we met every 2 or 3 years for about a decade. Sharing stories. It was a global thing.
Okay.
So I first met with them in Hawaii, and then a few years later we were in Sweden. After that we were in Israel, and then we went back to New Zealand. And so this group really met all over the world, and it was a gathering of indigenous Christians coming together to share stories, to share experiences, to talk about how was each tribe beginning to contextualize the worship of Christ, the presentation of the gospel for their context, for their worldview, their language, their traditions, and their people.
Wow. So is that organization still
The organization,
working?
the members are still around. We haven't had a gathering in a number of years now. Richard Twiss, who actually is a native leader who lived up near Portland, he was one of the leaders of this organization. Another man from New Zealand named Monty Ohia. Both of these leaders, and really incredible leaders in their context, passed away over the past decade. And so there's still other key leaders of this group, but the group hasn't gathered together. It's been a number of years now, probably 5 or 6 years, I think, since our last gathering.
Wow. So as you come to Corban, what sort of message would you, like if you left, what was the one thing that you, or a few things you would really want us to understand from your visit?
Well, so on Monday, in the chapel on Monday, I spoke about the Doctrine of Discovery. And that's really, over the past 5 or 6 years, that's been one of the center points of my study, of my writing, of my speaking. I blog, I speak, I write. I'm actually working on a book right now regarding the Doctrine of Discovery. And most people around the country, Christian or non-Christian, have never heard of the Doctrine of Discovery. And so I came here, I was invited here to teach about that, and then I very much connect this teaching into the process of lament. So for those who don't know, the Doctrine of Discovery, it's essentially a series of papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493. It's the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by Christian rulers, those people are less than human, and the land's yours for the taking. So it says stuff like, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce them to perpetual slavery. I mean, this was literally the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the African people. They weren't fully human. This is the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was lost at sea, land in this new world that was inhabited by millions and claimed to have discovered it. Because the bias was, the implicit racial bias was, we weren't fully human. I mean, if you think about it, you cannot discover lands already inhabited. That's called stealing, conquering, colonizing. Because what we call it today, we teach it today, what Columbus did was discovery. It reveals the implicit racial bias of the nation, which is natives aren't fully human. So the challenge with this doctrine, and what people aren't aware of, is that it's been embedded into the foundations of the country. So the Declaration of Independence, 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, it refers to natives as merciless Indian savages. Making it very clear, the only reason they said all men is because our founding fathers had a very narrow definition of who actually was and who was not human. The Constitution begins with the inclusive terms, we the people. Just a few lines below that, Article 1, Section 2, it defines who's a citizen of this nation, who we the people includes. It never mentions women. It specifically excludes natives, and it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So we the people literally meant white landowning men. And then it got further embedded in 1823, when there was a case called Johnson versus McIntosh. This is two men of European descent. They're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them acquired the land from the government. The other got it from a native tribe. They want to know who owned it. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had to decide the principle upon which land titles were based. They concluded that discovery was the principle that gave title to the land. And then they used the doctrine of discovery. They referenced it as a legal instrument to determine that based on the doctrine of discovery, natives, who are less than human, only had the right of occupancy to land, while Europeans had the right of discovery to the land and therefore the true title to it. So this created, along with a few other cases during that era, the martial court era, created the legal precedent for land titles. And this precedent and the doctrine of discovery gets referenced by the court as recently as 2005. So we're not talking about ancient history, centuries old. This is affecting our lives today. This doctrine of discovery it's used in our court systems today because it's the legal precedent, it's the worldview, it's the understanding that our founding documents were written out of and built on.
Okay. So Jim teaches American thought and culture. So how does Corban, how do we teach this time of history? How?
Well, this is very interesting. In some ways, Mr. Charles has reinforced where we were last week in American thought and culture. The notion that this was an empty continent. Well, there are a few people here, but they can kind of get out of the way. And so was claimed and owned on the other side of the ocean. So when Roger Williams objects in Massachusetts Bay Colony to some of these practices and says, actually, it looks like there were people here that owned this land that we're sitting on now, I think we should pay them. He got himself into all kinds of grief. In the first place, the King of England owned the land, right? So this doesn't sound like a politically correct statement. Secondly, there was this conflation, as Mr. Charles pointed out in chapel, this conflation with Old Testament Israel. The other day we read Mary Rowlandson's captivity narrative. She's taken captive during King Philip's war. King Philip was a Wampanoag chief. And in, I think, 8 pages we counted 12 biblical references. 10 of those were from the Old Testament. Now, we usually quote from the Gospels or the epistles. They quoted frequently and heavily from the Old Testament. There's a reason for this. These folks talked about being delivered from bondage, crossing the water. The last place we lived in New York State when I was a kid before we moved west was not far from a village called New Canaan. So what's the pattern? If you are if you are identifying yourself with Old Testament Israel, Mr. Williams, you don't pay Canaanites. What do? Well, you move them off or you smite them. Maybe both. Also, you're very fussy about your neighbor's behavior. So if you have this corporate relationship with God, a model of Christian charity that you mentioned the other day, then I'm kind of worried about you. Because if you mess up, well, that's a problem for me, maybe. You know, my wife is barren, my crops don't grow, my business fails. So we're nervous about each other, and a kind of public righteousness becomes the order of the day. So you have ducking stools and stocks, which I think does 2 things. Number one, it says to everybody else, don't do that. And it also says to God, we have this corporate relationship. Thus stands the cause between ourselves and God. The guy that preached that sermon wrote the first governor. It says to God, see, we are excising the evil. And I say this because this brings us to 1692 in the Salem witch trials. And I say that because Cotton Mather is appointed to write the history of this. He did not participate, but he was an observer. And he says in his prologue that this is just the latest. What's happened here now with this witchcraft is just the latest attempt of the devil to suppress and maybe eradicate, or now corrupt from the inside, this righteous community, the people of God who are occupying now, he says, the land that once was the devil's. Well, what does that mean about the people who are living on this land? It was once, the quote is, once the devil's territory. And clearly that's inclusive of the people living in there. So, these issues and these understandings did not go away, even when the Puritans were no longer the spokespeople for a whole section of the country. So there's assumptions early on. I don't know if I would want to say that these people thought the natives weren't humans, but they weren't the same kind of humans, that's for sure. And so that justifies, a different kind of treatment that I think if one by one you would ask these Puritan leaders, would you treat people like this? That, well, they're in a different category.
Yeah.
So that allows all kinds of behavior that is indefensible, really. So this came at a very good time for my students in American thought and culture. They just got done reading this stuff.
Yeah, yeah, and like you brought up the sermon from John Winthrop.
Yes.
You know, that whole notion of promised lands.
Yes.
You know, when John Winthrop begins quoting Deuteronomy chapter
Yes.
30, at the end of his sermon, and his actual quote in that sermon. So the book says, the passage says, "But if our hearts shall turn away, so that we will not obey," he goes on a little later, it says, "and we worship other gods, we shall surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over." Now, Deuteronomy 30 says river. John Winthrop says vast sea.
Yep.
Clearly implying
Yes.
that based on the model of Old Testament Israel, we're standing on the banks
Yes.
of our promised land,
That's right.
about ready to take possession of it.
Yes.
And so I on Monday I did this, and wherever I go I do this. I pinpoint this sermon as one of the birthplaces of this notion of American exceptionalism. This notion that we have this unique relationship with
Yes.
God, we're somehow separate from the other nations. And I mean, if you read the book of Joshua, as you were saying earlier, the command to the people of Israel is to
Move 'em off.
destroy the Canaanite.
Yeah.
It's God-ordained genocide. So that's how our country, I mean, one of the quotes that I use frequently is that American exceptionalism, it's a coping mechanism for a nation that's in deep denial of its genocidal past and its current racist reality. That's how we cope with our history, is we tell ourselves that we're exceptional. Because otherwise, if we're not exceptional, then that means we're accountable. And that's a terrifying thought to the country.
So that leads to, Alan's done a lot of thinking in Old Testament. So when you hear this story, so is this true? Is America seeing ourselves as the new Israel?
I think that connection that with Manifest Destiny and this is the new Canaan and that sort of thing, I think it'd be widely recognized. I would probably defer to Professor Hills and the American History Department that would be able to handle that better. I think one of the questions that's kind of come up for me is if we make I think we'd all tend to agree, this is not necessarily what we should be doing with the Old Testament. They did it there, so therefore I should do it here. As somebody who does love the Old Testament scriptures, and even I appreciated your references in chapel to Nehemiah, and I think Nehemiah would lament for this. I think one of the questions that came up for me as a interpretive principle is, okay, there are certain things that I shouldn't do with the Old Testament, but do we then therefore completely write off the Old Testament because that was simply for Israel? Well, Paul seems to think the scriptures are good for, and he leads on, and he's talking about his Old Testament. The New Testament hasn't been written yet; it's being written. Yeah. And that idea, like when you quoted in chapel, I think Nehemiah would lament at this. Perhaps he would have, but he was also lamenting the fact that his political empire has fallen. He's lamenting the fact that his capital city in Jerusalem has burned. Yeah. And so that idea that yes, we can identify with Nehemiah, but maybe there's certain things we aren't wanting to identify with. And I appreciated that
Yeah.
question you forced on us about how close to power do we need to be. He was close to power, wanted to be close to power. What do we do with the Old Testament then if there are abuses of it, but at the same time you seem to want to hold on to it in certain ways? Where do we go with that?
So, one of the ways that I find is very helpful, and I have a friend, he lives in Jerusalem. He's a Messianic Jewish pastor, and he's worked within the Orthodox community in Jerusalem for a number of years. And he and I actually did discipleship together. So I spent time with him in Jerusalem, learning how he works within the Orthodox community there. He spent time with me on the reservation, learning how I work within my people group and on our reservation. And one of the things that I've come to understand that he taught me, and as I've continued to explore this, is basically as Americans, we've been taught to read the Old Testament scriptures incorrectly. We've been taught to read them putting ourselves in the place of Israel. We're a city on a hill. We're exceptional. We are the new Israel. And so we read the Old Testament story as if it were our own. Instead, I mean, if you actually put ourselves as Americans into the Old Testament narrative, we're the Gentiles. We're the pagan nations. We're the outside entity. So not that we can't grow and benefit and understand from the Old Testament, but we're really reading it as outside observers. We are not, these are not promises that God's making with our people. Now, Paul uses the Old Testament, but he primarily uses it to prove Christ is the Messiah. He doesn't use it as a law that the Gentiles are supposed to adhere to. So he's not trying so he's using the Old Testament to demonstrate, look, Christ was a Jew, he came out of this history, this is what it is. So we use the Old Testament to prove that, but then he's not taking the laws of the Old Testament and telling the Gentiles, you have to live by these laws, these are your laws and your covenants, and these are the things that you need to live by now. And so that's the biggest challenge. The other thing, and I was just talking about this a little earlier today, is one of the challenges I see most Americans have with the Old Testament goes all the way back to the book of Genesis. So it's tempting. A lot of American Christians, they read the book of Genesis as if it was a science textbook or even as if it were historical narrative. The beginning of Genesis, it's not historical narrative and it's not a textbook. It's a creation story. The purpose of a creation story is to help a people understand their relationship within the land and their relationship to the Creator. It is a creation story. There's two creation stories there, one where man's created first, the other where man's created last. And the second creation story actually names the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So it's giving the people context of where they're living there. Now, one of the challenges for most American and European Christians is they're so far removed from their indigenous roots and from their people's creation stories that they've co-opted the Middle Eastern creation stories that get recorded in the Bible. And so then they use those creation stories as scientific truth of this is how creation happened, because they don't understand the role creation stories play and how they work within the context. And so a lot of American Christians, they cling to this biblical creation story like it was their own creation story, and then they discount everyone else's creation story. So I have a friend, I believe it was his great-great-grandfather was the chief of his people's tribe in Africa when the first missionaries came there. And they came and they brought the gospel, and a few people became Christians, and they began translating the scriptures. And as they were translating, the missionary was adamant. He said, we cannot use your word for creator in this translation because we don't want any of your pagan religion to taint this translation, this holy scripture. And my friend's great-great-grandfather, he said, well, sir, our people have been worshiping and building a relation with the Creator for generations. We've known him for a long time. We just didn't know he had a son. If you force us to use your word for God in this translation, then this book will merely be about the white man's God. If you allow us to use our word for Creator in this scripture, then this book will be a continuation of the general revelation we've already had of Creator into this new book. And so, very wisely, the missionary decided, well, let's use your word for Creator in this. And so that's one of the challenges is, as missionaries, Western missionaries, we tend to think we're bringing God places. This was a place of the devil before missionaries came here. Well, no, that's not true. God created the earth. He sent his people out all over. God's been doing general revelation to people since the beginning. Our job as missionaries, our job as Christians is we're not bringing God anywhere. We're trying to connect what God's already been doing to his son Christ. This is what Paul was doing in the temple when he said, I see you have idols to many gods. Let me tell you about this one that you call an unknown God. He's using their context to explain who God and who Jesus is. We don't typically do that. And a lot of that is because most of our Christians are so far removed from their indigenous traditional roots. They don't know their creation stories, so they've co-opted the biblical creation story, and they say this is the only creation story that's true, and everything else has to be cast aside if we're going to worship this God. And I don't think that's an accurate reading of the Old Testament. I don't think that's not that it's not a good creation story, but it's definitely not the only creation story, and it's not a science book. Mm-hmm. It's not a historical narrative. It's a creation story that helps the people understand who they are in the land they're living in and what their relationship to this Creator is.
So Alan is a Old Testament guy. What interact with us a little bit here. This is
you've put out enough things on the table that we could spend hours talking in a lot of those things. But on a certain level, I won't want to argue on all different points, but I think the broader question that was the question that came out in chapel, and that is that what is that relationship between a story for other people versus a story that I can relate to in a certain way, and maybe even to come back to the Nehemiah question. And I don't want to stick on it if you don't want to answer it, but I don't feel like I've heard the answer in it yet. Nehemiah lamented the loss of his empire, and yet you still talked about like he can model for us lament over things that have gone wrong, and he also is a person that laments sins that he never committed himself. Yeah. He laments the sins of his fathers and the people that lost the land. So on a certain level, there is that connection to what you were talking about. Like I can use Nehemiah as a model, but at the same time, I think you were rejecting part of that idea of Nehemiah was asking for Jerusalem to be rebuilt so that we can reestablish our theocracy, our God nation. Yeah. And in that sense, maybe you want to avoid that. And so maybe looking for that line between how does a person adopt and yet stand apart from. And so that's a problem, I think.
Yeah, so the whole point of the chapel on Monday was there's a lot of people who identify the original sin of our nation is racism. Mm-hmm. That's not where I identify our original sin. The original sin of the church, of the Christian empire, is believing there's a Christian empire. Mm-hmm. The entire chapel was about we need to get out of bed with the empire and become the separate prophetic entity the church, the bride of Christ, was meant to be from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And so while Nehemiah was lamenting the breaking down of the walls of his capital city, I'm calling the church, which God didn't create a Christian empire through Christ. He created the church. Mm-hmm. This is now the vehicle that he's working to bring salvation to the world. This is the way that he's revealing himself. This is the entity that he's using to help us understand and relate to him better. And so that entity, the church, the way its sin was allowing Constantine to put it into bed with the empire, to create Christendom. And so that's where the walls are broken down. That's where the church has begun to crumble, is because it's now been in bed with the empire for 1,100 years. It's taking on the characteristics of its lover. It's taking on the sins and the challenges and the problems, and what that's doing is that's blemishing, that's corrupting, that's breaking down the walls of what the church, what the bride of Christ was supposed to do. And so it's not about so yes, Nehemiah was lamenting the breaking down of his walls, of their Jerusalem, and I was calling us to lament the breakdown of what's been happening to the church, where the church now embraces very easily this nationalism. It embraces this Christian entity. It either thinks we used to be Christian or we should be Christian as a nation, and we're not.
So there's a sense of spiritualization of Old Testament ideas, and just where one goes with that is where the fruit comes out.
Yeah, so it's understanding I'm looking at the Old Testament, and if I'm drawing any implications, it's either coming to me as a Gentile, looking outside the Christian narrative, or if I'm connecting myself in any way through the Old Testament, it's through the church, which has a very different role and set of ground rules than Israel had.
Okay.
And so it's not, so the church it's not, there's a very different set of rules for what Israel was supposed to do and what the church is supposed to do.
This is great. Yeah, I kind of sense that we could go for another 3 hours maybe. There are so many questions that I still have. And so luckily we have things like social media, right? So we can still talk to each other. Just in conclusion, what's the bottom line you have 3 white landowning males here around the table. So what do we need to understand better? So if you could summarize that, probably way oversimplifying it, but
yeah. So the thing that I'm trying to get the church to understand is that our identity is not found in the empire. The empire doesn't save us. The empire doesn't protect us. The empire doesn't justify us. And we can't be complicit with the empire. We need to be separate entities. That doesn't mean we have to revoke our citizenship. I mean, Paul was a Roman citizen, but so we're not revoking our citizenship. We're not trying to destroy the empire, but we're understanding that our citizenship is in a nation that has ideals and values and goals that are very separate from Christ. And our goal, we're never going to make the empire Christian. It was never designed to be Christian. God isn't trying to make it Christian. We need to be the church, understanding what our relationship with the empire is, and that our identity is separate from it. And so what does it mean for us to begin to question all the things that we've always taken for granted? Because we've grown up with this thing that's taught us we can read the Old Testament narrative and put ourselves as Americans in the place of Israel. We can read these passages from Jeremiah. We can read these passages in the Old Testament of God's land covenant, and God's going to heal our land, and we can read that as Americans and apply that to ourselves. No, we can't. The church doesn't have a land covenant with the God of Israel. America doesn't have a land covenant with the God of Israel. All of God's promises in the Old Testament to heal the land are part of his covenant with the people of Israel. There's no such promise with the church.
Yeah, that's good. So this is also probably controversial. You probably have you had pushback and when you present these ideas?
Sometimes yes, but frequently no. It's not as much. The pushback I get generally comes from a position of denial, because we're not used to thinking about ourselves that way, and we actually use the Christian empire to justify a plethora of sins. Mm-hmm. And so that's why at the end of the chapel on Monday, I ended with this story from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe about Aslan. And I brought people back to this fact that as a Christian, God can do what he wants to do with the empire. He can judge it. He can do what he wants with it. That doesn't affect our salvation. We can be confident. We can be separate from the empire. We can even endure the judgment of the empire because our salvation is found in Christ. We are covered by the blood of Christ. And God's not going to look at us any differently based on what our passport reads. Mm-hmm. That has no, we tend to cling to this notion of a Christian empire like our salvation depends on it. So when I deconstruct the empire through the Doctrine of Discovery, people feel disconcerted or uncomfortable because they've actually been finding their comfort in the empire. So then that's why at the end of the talk, I go back and remind them, actually, your comfort comes from the blood of Christ. Yes, this is shaking you, but it's shaking you because you're finding your justification somewhere you shouldn't be. If your justification is in the blood of Christ, this should be cause for concern, but it's not something that's going to shake you to your core. So I'm trying to get people back to, we have to find our identity where it's supposed to be.
Awesome. Well, I think we all, no matter who, can agree with that. So I want to thank you so much. Thanks, Alan and Jim. And this is a great discussion, and hopefully it will open all kinds of different talks around our campus. And I really appreciate you coming. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure to be here. It's been great to get to know all of you this week.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.